The Carter Ranch stretched for miles across Wyoming land, rolling fields kissed by wind and rimmed by blue-gray mountains that seemed to guard every sorrow and every secret the family carried, and in the center of that land stood a man named Luke Carter, a cowboy whose silence was so heavy it seemed even the cattle respected it. Once upon a time Luke had been a man whose laughter carried across valleys, a sound so hearty and strong that ranch hands swore they could hear it above the rumble of thunder and the creak of barn doors, but that was years ago, before tragedy tore laughter from him and left behind only a shadow of a man who lived by routine, by work, and by an emptiness he never spoke of. His family gathered at long dinner tables and whispered when they thought he could not hear. They told each other he would never laugh again, that the sound had died inside him the day his younger brother James was thrown from a horse and never rose again, for Luke had been the one who had saddled that restless animal. Luke had been the one who had clapped James on the shoulder and told him to ride, and though no one else blamed him, Luke carried it like a branding iron pressed against his heart, and every night when the stars burned over the prairie, he swore he could still hear James's voice in the wind, and he swore he would not allow himself to laugh when his brother could not. So his days were spent in silence, his boots in the dust, his hands on the reins, his heart locked behind a wall higher than the mountains, until one summer afternoon when fate came rattling into Carter's Crossing on the back of a dusty stagecoach and brought with it Clara Hayes, a schoolteacher from back east with a sharp tongue, a warm smile, and the kind of wit that could spark even the gloomiest soul if only it caught him off guard. And Clara was not the sort of woman to shrink from anything. She stepped off the coach with a carpetbag in one hand, her skirts brushed with dust, and a glimmer in her eye that suggested she had no intention of being cowed by ranch gossip or long stares. She introduced herself to the town with a joke about how the driver had handled the reins as if he were trying to outpace death itself, and the blacksmith laughed so hard he nearly dropped his hammer. The grocer chuckled as he carried her parcels. Even the sheriff cracked a smile, but when Clara asked about the man she glimpsed on horseback near the ridge, a tall cowboy with shoulders like stone and eyes the color of storm clouds, as she noticed how the townsfolk lowered their voices, and the grocer's wife told her in a tone hushed with sympathy that was Luke Carter, a man who had lost too much, a man who no longer laughed, no longer smiled, and probably never would again. And Clara, who had a stubborn streak as long as a river, felt something stir in her heart at those words, for she had always believed no soul was beyond the reach of light. So when she saw him again days later in the general store, his hat pulled low, his boots heavy, and his silence like a weight filling the room, she could not resist speaking. She had been at the counter bargaining cheerfully with the shopkeeper about the outrageous rise in sugar prices, claiming she might have to ask her students to pay in molasses instead of coin. And her jest made the old man laugh until his spectacles fogged, but Luke only passed by her, reaching for flour and coffee beans as though humor were a foreign language, and Clara, quick as lightning, turned her sharp gaze on him and said, "You look like a man who could wrestle a steer but couldn't wrestle a smile if his life depended on it." And silence fell in the store. The shopkeeper froze, his pen hanging over the ledger. A woman near the back covered her mouth, expecting Luke Carter to snap at the stranger who dared to speak so bold, but Luke only paused, the line of his jaw tightening, his eyes shifting to Clara with a mixture of surprise and irritation, and then something no one expected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched, his lips curved the slightest bit, and then, low and rough, came a sound like an old door creaking open, the faintest chuckle, but a laugh nonetheless, and the shopkeeper nearly dropped his ledger. Clara grinned as if she had won a duel, and Luke muttered, "Your trouble," as though the admission itself were a sin, but there was still a glimmer in his eyes that had not been there for years, and Clara leaned against the counter with the confidence of a woman who knew she had struck something deep and said, "Well, Mr. Carter, trouble has been known to do a world of good now and then," and though Luke walked out with his supplies, the whisper of that laugh still on his lips, the entire town was already buzzing. By nightfall, folks whispered that Luke Carter had smiled, that he had laughed, and though his family sat around their supper table in shock when the news reached them, their uncle shaking his head and saying it couldn't be true, deep down they prayed it was. for they had long given up hope, and as for Luke himself, he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling of his darkened room, wondering how a slip of a woman he'd never seen before had managed to crack the walls